Cool. So happy St. Patrick's Day. Excited to kick off. We have a ton to cover today. So we're going to talk about fundraising from older donors. We have a lot. And a big thank you to my colleague Simone and a bunch of other people that put a lot of research and hard work into this to make it great for you all. Couple admin notes before we get started. This, like all the other sessions, is eligible for 1.0 CFRE credits. If this is your first time here. There's a survey at the end, and you'll have to make a note in that so we can register your attendance. So just look out for that at the end of the session. If you don't know what CFRE is, it's a professional development certification for nonprofit fundraisers, and you can sort of work your way up. And you need a certain number of hours to get it, and then you need a certain number of hours to maintain it. And so because a lot of professional development budgets have been shrunk over the past 2 years, we've put a bunch of effort on our side into making sure that all this stuff is both free and eligible for this. So hopefully that's useful to you all. Okay, introductions. So our agenda for today, very quickly, we'll do intros. We'll talk a little bit about how your week is going and some of the things we heard from you. We'll talk deeply about trends affecting older donors, and then what do we actually do about it from a fundraising standpoint? And then we'll talk about some next steps in Q&A. Important note here, recording and slides are going to be sent to you, usually about a couple hours after we're done. We process it, we upload it to YouTube, then we send it out. And so if you are, if you want to furiously take notes because that's the best way you learn, great. But you don't have to. Feel free to sit back and enjoy your lunch or your breakfast, depending on what coast you're on. Also, one note is that we're not currently able to subtitle these, but oftentimes you can turn subtitles on the YouTube recording in case that's easier for you. We've also tried to put a lot of text on the screen for folks who are a little bit harder of hearing. And so that's some steps we're taking on that. All right, so quick intros. I've met so many of you personally, in person or remotely. My name is Patrick. I'm lucky to be one of 2 co-CEOs of an organization called FreeWill. And together we're almost 175 people as of today, have generated $5.3 billion in gifts and commitments. We really focus on transformational giving and how do you make it easier for both donors and for folks like you all. That's not that important. What is important is one of the things we like to do on these sessions is give away some books as a big thank you for joining. And so in this case, we often sort of give modern books away that we really love. We're going to focus on a couple of the books that really define the generation of older donors that we're going to talk about right now. And so To Kill a Mockingbird by by Harper Lee, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, this is by Maya Angelou, and The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Some of you have read this. At least several of these books are going to have some adult themes, so just a warning in case you get them. Don't blame us, blame the 60s. Just make a note in the survey if you'd like a copy of it too. If you'd like a copy of these, and then we obviously sort of randomly select folks because 1,000-ish people is too expensive to send all these books to. Okay, so how's your week going? This is what we heard from you, and we've been tracking this since the dawn of the pandemic in early March. Almost exactly 2 years ago. So our first webinar was 2 years and 2 days ago. And it's been really delightful to be with you since then, tracking this happiness curve. And you can see it actually shot back up, which was honestly sort of surprising to us based on world events after 2 weeks ago. Anxiety is a bit down. Loneliness is actually at its all-time low in the survey results, which maybe compared to June 15th, so second lowest, but really interesting stuff there. So it's been quite a week, but glad to see that everybody's sticking together. And we also asked how you're feeling, confident you're feeling about hitting your goals this year, and a slight decrease from last week, excuse me. And so, what might bake into this, a little bit more inflation, a little bit more concerns about the economy. The stock market's been pretty jittery lately, lots of ups and lots of downs. And so we'll keep an eye on this going forward. Great. Ooh. I just saw a note from Lauren, which is great, who tells me that she's joining the FreeWill team next Monday. So welcome, Lauren. Really excited to have you here. All right, so understanding older donors. Let's talk about this. When we asked you how you thought about and how you would describe older donors, you used words like loyal and generous and dedicated and caring and committed, a lot of this sort of repetitious language, right? That people are sort of with you and sticking with you, which is really, really exciting. But first, when we talk about older donors, let's define who we're actually speaking about. So there are 2 generations we're going to discuss. The first is the silent generation. This is, for the most part, the sort of oldest generation currently living in large numbers, born 1928 to 1945, and then boomers born 46 to 64. And so you'll see actually in a moment how much larger, not just among folks who are still alive, but ever the boomer generation is compared to the silent generation. What it means is that because the boomer generation is so much larger, that in the last decade, the number of people in the United States over 65 grew by a third, which is sort of remarkable. So there are 14 million more 65 plus people than there were 10 years ago, which is really striking. It really shifts the way we think about this. It shifts the way the economy is working. It shifts the way fundraising is working, certainly. So there's about 52 million people in this category. We don't have to tell you twice, but these folks own most of the wealth in the United States, and we'll talk about that in a second. We talked about this demographic shift, right? And this is really remarkable. This is birth rates over time. And so that huge dip on the left, that's the folks the silent generation was born into, right? So some of that is certainly my grandparents. Some of you might have grandparents in there, or probably not a ton of folks here with parents in that. But what you see here is there are very few people being born then. Now, why? Great Depression, right? A lot of economic anxiety reduces childbearing rates. And then in the latter half of that period, World War II. And so World War II means you have a lot of men in particular at that point deployed overseas and obviously not having children by that sense. Everyone comes home in 1945. The way that babies work means babies start showing up in 1946. And you see this sort of massive demographic curve all the way through about 1964. So you have 10,000 people turning 75 every day in the United States, which is really one of the sort of most important stories that is underreported because it's so constant. When you think about what this means for right now, you can see how this orange graph, right? This is 65 to 84, and that blue graph is 85 plus. As a percentage of people in the United States, you can see how much more meaningful it is than say 1960 or 1980 or 2000, right? So not only are older donors important right now, they're increasingly becoming a dominant part of American society to a degree that's vastly different than a decade ago. But first, we're talking about older donors here, and I actually think that's the wrong way to think about it. So I want to offer a little bit of a framework for how to think about these folks, and not just think about them as older donors. So there's two ways to think about anyone of a given age, right? We can think about them as of a certain age, or we can think about them as a birth year, right? And these are really different. My example here is bridge. So does anyone here play bridge? Just feel free to note in the chat. I mean, I think we'll have some folks, but relatively few. And when I was growing up, my grandparents on both sides, my mom's parents, my dad's parents. All right, we have Jennifer. Very impressed with you. Jennifer, actually tell us if you learned from your grandparents or similar. But when I was growing up, both sets of grandparents played bridge. And in my mind, this is a thing that old people did. All the old people I knew played bridge. My parents didn't play bridge. My friends didn't play bridge. Nobody played bridge. And what I realized is that it's not an old person game. It's a game for people who were born of a certain decade. And they were playing bridge at 18 and 28 and 38 and 48 and 58 and at 78. And so bridge actually isn't a function of being old. Bridge is a function of having been born in a certain time, right? Your millennials and your Gen Zers and some of your Gen Xers are going to be playing video games at 80, because video games are not a proxy of how old you are. They're a proxy of when you were born. Now, something like having knee problems or being eligible for Social Security is a proxy of age and not birth year. And so we should be really thinking about this, because what happens, and I found this to be true with fundraisers, is we think about older donors and we think often about the older people that we grew up with. But that's different than older people now, because we think about this in age, and we really should be thinking about this by birth year and generation. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Great. All right. So a shared context on, again, not just older folks, but folks that were born into these generations. So they're much more religious. 80% of boomers, 90% of silents identify with religion, compared to only 35% of millennials. They tend to be less educated than younger generations. So 25% of boomers, 10% of silents have bachelor's degrees or more, compared to 40% of millennials. Other shared facts, they're also more married, with more children. Many are now grandparents. So 67% of boomers, 83% of silents were married when they were 25 to 37, compared to only 46% of millennials, right? 58% of boomer women were mothers between the age of 20 and 35, compared to only 48% of millennials. And we start to see that drifting down with Gen Zers. Craig, great pick. Great catch. So these are actually my parents, who were born in the 50s. I won't tell you exactly how they were. They were married at 22 and 21, which is unfathomable to me, but it was product of a different time. They actually just celebrated their 43rd wedding anniversary, which is a little bit nuts. So they look a little bit. I'm really impressed with Craig that he picked that up. Nice job, Craig. Okay, so let's talk about, to understand these folks, let's sort of understand the life they had before we get into what their life is like right now. So their childhoods were shaped by Cold War and McCarthyism. They grew up in the civil rights movement, cultural shifts of the 50s and 60s. They fought in and protested the Vietnam War. They were also the first to see innovative technology like color TV, right? The same folks that saw color TV, then saw cable, then saw the internet, then saw the first iPhone. I mean, really sort of remarkable shifts over the course of one lifetime. So let's actually just dive into what an average 75-year-old American, this is someone who's born in the States, right? So obviously there are a lot of boomers who have immigrated since. Born in 1947, immediately after World War II ends, right? So their father was likely to be enlisted in some form in fighting World War II. At age 5, they would have what are called duck and cover drills around the nuclear war during the Cold War. And what that means, there's some of you have seen this, there's literally a turtle cartoon who sort of models duck and cover for school children. And it means like get in an alley, get under a desk, do something if you see a mushroom cloud, if you hear a flash, or if you see a flash. And so this is a sort of remarkable part of a 5-year-old's life. 16, so they're really of age and deeply aware when color TV becomes more mainstream. And also John F. Kennedy is assassinated. At 18, Martin Luther King is assassinated. Those numbers might be off. So at 68, I think that might be, let's say, we'll figure it out. When they're 22, the first man walks on the moon. The Vietnam draft starts. It's Woodstock. I mean, this is very much the sort of shaping of the generation. And 27, Nixon resigns. The oil embargo is underway, right? So the last time we had sort of massive inflation in the 70s and 80s, but they're 27, so this is core part of their beginning of their professional life. And then age 37, the first Apple Mac computer comes out, right? So they were young when color TV showed up, and then still pretty young when the first computer comes out. By 46, and this is a really important point, right? So they're 46, they're in the prime of their working career in many cases, when the AOL gains popularity, America Online. AOL is sort of a fascinating acronym because online is one word, but AOL gains popularity, internet goes mainstream. At age 54, 9/11 happens, cell phones are ubiquitous by this point. At 60, the first Black president is elected, the first iPhone is released. 68, Supreme Court rules in favor of gay marriage after this being illegal in almost all states for almost all their life. Age 73, COVID hits. This will be familiar to you all, but age 74, first female vice president is inaugurated. So they've gone basically 73 years without having a woman as a president or vice president. And this is basically the existence, right? So you think about sort of growing up pre-color TV, seeing a man walk on the moon, seeing the internet arrive, seeing the smartphones existed, seeing a globally connected world, what that means for 9/11, what it means for global pandemic, also what it means for massive increases in overall economic activity. I mean, billions of people have been lifted out of poverty in their lifetime, which is really sort of a remarkable existence. And these are the people that we're talking to, right? So it's easy to sort of snapshot them right now, but let's make sure we're putting it in context. What this means, and partly this is all shaped, together boomers in silence make up 61% of all charitable contributions. So when we think about donors, we're really thinking about these people. They prefer to give to well-known, respected organizations. 45% of boomers will research an organization before making a gift. Nearly 40% of both generations, not just boomers, right, silence included, give online through a website. Remember, these folks were doing email in their 40s. So this is not our traditional view of older folks. When we look about who they're prioritizing and whom they're giving to, you can see here, worship, local social services, health, emergency relief. These are the top 4 for this group. And then in contrast for Gen Z, children, kid stuff, animals, health, millennials also pretty high on worship, despite some sort of thought to the contrary, local social service as well. And so you also see sort of more military related giving in terms of older folks. What percentage of your donor base is over 65? When we asked you this, I mean, it's just astounding to see this reflected, right? So 54% of you said between 1/2 and 3/4, and then 15% of you said between 3/4 and everybody is over 65. So really heavy concentrations here. So what's happening to this group right now? We talked about their big life, talked about how it's shaping some of philanthropy. Let's dive into a couple of things. right? The first is this group was very tech savvy pre-pandemic, right? Before COVID, 73% of folks were regular internet users. 68% of them and 40% of silents owned a smartphone in 2019. These numbers are shooting up, right? Because of COVID, internet and phone usage has shot up remarkably among all these cohorts. They increasingly use social media to connect with friends and family. This became a lifeline to many people during the pandemic, right? For all of the flaws of social media, and there are plenty, for a lot of people during pandemic, it was a lifeline to connect with a ton of folks. Older donors are now going online, not just to give cash gifts, but to a significant degree to make major and planned gifts. Online giving increased by 42% in the last 3 years. And the average age of an online donor is 65, right? So this is the median, or the mean online donor is 65. So as many folks above as below. Really, really important information there. 2018 study by Blackbaud, which is already a bit out of date, so we can push these numbers up. 54% of boomers prefer to give via online channels versus only 19% from direct mail. And so you're seeing direct mail sort of ebb as a flow here, as a giving mechanism here. 34% of boomers reported donating via newer channels in 2021. So not only are we looking at this path in 2018, but the adoption continues and continues and continues. Older donors are highly likely to go online to donate, even for more complex gifts. So when we ask, we at FreeWill, we do a lot of work with both stock giving and what are called qualified charitable distributions. We're going to dive into these in a second. These are gifts out of an IRA for people who are by law over 70. We ask folks to link the QCD tool to make on their website to make it really easy. And when folks do, they're generating 4 times as many qualified charitable distributions, right? So when these gifts are available online, there's a massive uptake in online giving through these mechanics, which is really interesting. The second thing that's happening, so first trend is just a huge shift online. And by the way, this isn't happening just in giving, right? Giving sort of tends to follow the rest of the economic trends. There's this fascinating stat that basically all of the growth in e-commerce over the last 2 years has all happened because older donors are rushing online to buy stuff, right? Instead of going to Target or wherever they might have gone before. Okay, other really important stuff. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 doubled the standard deduction for tax years 2018 and 2025. It also capped itemized deductions for state and local taxes at $10,000 a year. And by the way, it capped some of the deductions you can take for mortgages. Now, why is this important? Well, those two things were the biggest drivers of putting people over the standard deduction and into itemization territory. So most taxpayers now get bigger tax breaks from taking standard deductions than they do from itemizing deductions like charitable contributions. So take a look at this. In 2017, 30% of American tax filers itemized deductions. By 2018, that was 10%. So much of your outreach and your sort of outbound mail and email say, make a tax deductible contribution, do this, do that. And for 90% of people, except for that little above the line deduction, which is pretty minimal compared to most of your donors, 90% of folks aren't actually getting the same tax benefit from giving cash that they historically have. And they're starting to figure this out. And so this is a really important shift. This change wasn't made with charitable giving in mind, but it has a massive impact on charitable giving. Okay, other trends that are happening, wealth is concentrating in this area, right? So we told you how many people there are in this group, but it turns out they also own all the money. So take a look at this top graph, right? This sort of dark purple. This is the amount of wealth as a percentage in the United States of people between 55 to 69, right? You can see it's almost half of all wealth is held by this group. Now we're looking at the 70 and over, almost 30% of all wealth is owned by this group. Now you see this, you might be in Gen Z, Gen X, 40, 54 and say, wow, what's happening to us? You have this massive decline from almost 40% in 2000 to almost 20% now. Now, what's happening there? Yeah, there are some things with the economy happening. The people who have savings and investments are growing at the fastest rate, but also there are just fewer people in that age bracket than there were 20 years ago. Because when the boomers were there, there's a lot of them. Gen X tends to be a smaller generation, similar to silence, right? And so that's a really big shift happening as well. When you look at average net worth and this growth, look at this, right? So if you are a millennial or a older Gen Zer in 2035, your average net worth hasn't actually shifted from 20 years ago. Now in 3651, there's a reasonable increase there, but look at that far right side, right? The 52 to 70-year-olds. wow, that growth is happening, right? Significantly. And so the wealth is really accumulating in this group. Why is that happening? Well, partly they're heavily invested in real estate, stocks, and IRAs. These things are all growing quite quickly. They benefited from a huge growth market. So yeah, you'll hear in the news, wow, the Dow is down, the Dow is up, whatever. If you actually zoom out, it's just massive growth over the last 2 decades. Real estate prices also, all of the home ownership wealth is accruing to this group. Boomers own 44% of real estate in 2021. Older generations have never, ever in our history had so much wealth compared to previous generations, which is why we really need to help some of these folks give it away. This is all from Business Insider, by the way. So now the other really big thing is that some of these folks are getting pretty old. And so we're going to start to see some of them passing away soon. We're already seeing that to a degree. What it means is that an estimated $68 trillion, this is the largest wealth transfer in human history, is going to be passed on from wealthy older generations over the next 25 years. Those folks are deciding right now who and where that money goes after they pass. Most of it's going to go to Gen X and older millennials, right? These will be your next biggest donors. And so as that family wealth starts to transfer, suddenly they're going to be 31-year-olds, 39-year-olds, 45-year-olds who are sitting on way more wealth than they had last year, which is why it's important to keep an open mind in philanthropy and not just sort of zero in on a few folks in your portfolio. But about $10 trillion might go to charities. This is from the group Cerulli. You can see $70 trillion, an estimated 10 to charities, 31 to Gen X, some of it to other baby boomers, 22 trillion to millennials. Gen Z is sort of not really in this group yet. But just to give you a sense, I mean, this is unfathomably large. And you can see the difference from 20 years ago, how much wealth is in that 70 plus bracket, how much wealth is in that 65 plus bracket. So this is, if you've ever thought about having a planned giving program, this is your moment, right? This is when all of this money is being allocated, and over the next 10 years is really going to start to trickle in. So really big stuff. We're also starting to see that the combination of pandemic and general aging of the population is creating a massive shift in estate planning. So this is actually data from our own site, people using FreeWill, which is our site, to make estate plans. It's now the number one tool in the country. So you can really see some of the shifts here. Massive upticks in August, in December, in January. I mean, just really, really strong peaks overall, because people are figuring out, what do I do with my entire life savings? And this turns out to be a gigantic amount of money. One other note, because we often get questions, and how does this differ from white donors compared to donors of color? There's some really interesting research done by our friend, Dr. Russell James, out at Texas Tech. And what he sees is planned giving has historically been donated by white donors. Why is that? Right? Are donors of color sort of just less interested in giving? What it turns out is that's actually not true, right? Research shows that Hispanic and African Americans actually have a higher stated interest in planned giving, right? Making a bequest, a charitable gift in their will or trust, than white Americans on average. For African Americans, this skews particularly religious, but even higher than other folks. And so why is it the case that ends up there being fewer planned gifts? Well, it turns out that the gap is of a lower likelihood to have an estate plan at death in the first place. And definitionally, if you don't have an estate plan, 0 of it goes to charity. And so there's a lot of work for us to do as a sector to make sure there's access here. It may be that there's sort of fewer lawyers around, and maybe they're less marketed to. There's a whole bunch of sort of possibilities here, but it's really important when we think about diversifying philanthropy to make sure we're diversifying access to estate planning, which then will create a whole lot more diversity in planned giving. So just a small note there for you all to keep in mind, because I know you're in charge of this at many of the biggest organizations in the country. All right, so what does this mean? What are nonprofits actually doing to change their approach to older donors here? A couple things. First, it's just worth sort of reiterating that there's a renewed focus on donors over 65, right? Yes, it's really important to get millennial donors. Yes, it's important to bring the next generation. We do a ton of work around crypto giving because it's actually unlocking a lot of major giving from millennials for the first time, and that's amazing. It's super important. You should definitely do it. But let's not sort of take our eye off the ball here. Of donors, of revenue, right? 24% of you say 3/4 to all of our revenue comes from folks over 65. 45% of you say half to 3/4. Only 22% say a quarter to half, right? So this is a relatively small portion of the population, right? And yet, they're responsible for the lion's share of all philanthropic giving to organizations like yours. So we really, really need to get this right. When we ask you what are the primary channels, A lot of you are using email. This is great. Direct mail is about equal, phone calls, events, social media, text messages, video calls. We're gonna make a couple of highlights here where we think you can be doing better. Text, this is deeply underutilized, right? 90% of this group is texting, and we'll text you back, and we'll be delighted to hear from you. And yet only 6% of folks, especially your major donors, this is a great way to stay in touch. What are the primary gifts when you're marketing to these folks? Obviously, cash is first and foremost, major gifts, bequests, QCDs, donor advised funds, stock, annuities, pretty small, charitable trust, pretty small, and crypto. Basically, nobody's marketing crypto to 65 plus. That's probably a good idea. But QCD, by the way, is a qualified charitable distribution. We're going to dive into this in a second. These are gifts out of an IRA after you're 70. A couple of things that you should probably be pushing the numbers up, right? So if we're chatting next year about the same topic, let's see higher rates of bequests, QCDs, and stock giving. These are going to be the most important gifts that you can be increasing among this age group, and it will get you much larger gifts from the same folks. All right, so how do we actually be more successful with these donors? First, let's make sure we're really thinking about this, again, as birth year, not age. So it's very easy to think social media is only for kids. Actually, Facebook's only for older folks at this point. So 78% of boomers, 37% of silents are regularly using Facebook. This is probably underreporting. You should be engaging with older donors across multiple mediums. So website, increasingly they're going to research you as opposed to wait to hear from you. And so you need to have different types of giving there. Social media, think about this as really your primary avenue, especially if you're on Facebook, is baby boomers, right? If you go to Instagram or you go to TikTok, different segment. But if you're on Facebook, think of it as baby boomers as your primary setup. Events in person, obviously, text messages is a really big opportunity here. And then direct mail for folks that are less online. But this is increasingly an expensive avenue to find a smaller and smaller segment. For social, on Facebook ads, you can think about targeting by location. So you probably know, if you're a community organization, what are the wealthiest zip codes? Let's start advertising there and seeing if we can draw in some more donors. Are we making sure that people who have visited our website are now seeing Facebook ads? If we have email addresses, you can actually upload them and target only those people or people that look a lot like them in your area. And that's really interesting. But then texting donors is vastly underutilized, right? So we don't mean mass texting, we just a quick note, right? If you have a 200-person major giving portfolio, you should be texting them once a month. It's very quick. 94% of donors over 70 text on a weekly basis. This honestly might be underreported as well. It might, my guess is that every single one of your major donors over 70 is texting. Also, make sure your website is up to date. This is really, really important. It's the single thing that people do best or make a mistake on. Make sure that you're linking to bigger giving methods for older donors, such as qualified charitable distributions, stocks, and planned giving. You don't just want to get a $40 gift from someone who could be giving you $12,000. As we mentioned earlier, when we found that linking to an easy way to get qualified charitable distributions or stock results in 2 to 4 times as many gifts on average. I mean, just jaw-dropping changes for a very simple shift, right? Just putting a link on your website to stock giving, especially, by the way, on your donate page, whenever you possibly can. If your donors are primarily older, you may want to think more about non-digital, but this should act, I would think about, if I was budgeting this, just dropping it by 10% every year, because you're seeing this shift happening. Most major donors are digitally savvy. There are some good non-digital assets. Postcards can be given to volunteers to be handwritten. This tends to be really, really effective. The other thing we like is there's a bunch of tools. mypostcard.com is one of them. We have no relation. We don't get any money from this. But about $3 each, you can actually send a picture of yourself and the donor. You can send a picture of the donor at a most recent museum event. You can send a picture of the wildlife flowers at the land trust and write on the back. And it tends, you can see the Hey Maria up top here, tends to have sort of a handwritten feel and feel really comfortable. And so it's a really nice way to send thank yous and other things like that. It probably takes 5 minutes to card. All right, second thing, this is really, really important. We've talked about it before, but it's the most important research in modern fundraising. An analysis of 1 million tax returns over 5 years showed that organizations strictly looking for cash grew by 11% over those 5 years. Organizations taking any non-cash assets grew by 50%. An organization taking appreciated securities like crypto or stock or other things grew by 66%. So just to reiterate this, 6 times faster growth just by taking additional types of gifts. So really, really important. Many of your older donors, though, are not aware of some of these tax-savvy methods. When we asked nonprofits, hey, do your donors know enough about qualified charitable distributions? 96% of you said no, they don't. We need to improve this overall. And it's not just qualified charitable distributions, it's things like stock or planned giving or other complex giving vehicles, all of which will result in much larger gifts than cash on average, right? The most important point of this whole portion of the deck is this. The fastest and most effective way to increase giving levels from exactly the same person is to change the way they give, right? You put so much time into tours, into reunions and everything else. The single most effective way to get a 5-time larger gift from the same person is to change their giving type, right? This is a really, really important lesson that most of your giving team needs to make sure it's internalized. And some of you are already doing quite well, and you can actually see it in your results, right? The organizations that are really good at this just vastly outpace their peers. It's actually not that hard to get good at, but you do need to start putting yourself in this mindset of whenever we can, we're taking something that's not cash because it's going to be much larger. All right. Most giving happens towards the end of the year, but if you wait from an education standpoint, you'll actually miss out. We found that nonprofits who emailed about qualified charitable distributions 3 times or more over the course of 2021 saw a massive boost in giving at end of year. The same is true of stock giving, right? So we need to make sure we're educating folks early to then reap the rewards towards end of year. And just look at this context. So if you send 0 or 1 or 2 or 3, this is how many end of year gifts you got from a qualified charitable distribution standpoint, similar to stock giving. So if you're educating donors about these ways to give, you will be massively successful towards end of year. And if you don't, they're not gonna do the thing you didn't ask them to do. And you'll end up with much smaller gifts from the same folks. Okay, this also extends to planned giving. We know that seniors are thinking about estate planning more than ever, and we need to be educating folks on this impactful way to give on a consistent basis. Sometimes we get this question, and this happened in a previous webinar, so we wanted to address it here. How do we talk to planned giving? How do we talk about planned giving to older folks? Does it feel offensive? Does it feel targeted? Is that weird? How do you do that comfortably and calmly, knowing that this might be a $200,000 gift from someone who's given me $20 before? And so we've done a ton of testing on this to figure out what works and what doesn't. Here's a couple of pieces of language you might use. And again, we'll send the deck around after, so feel free to copy this, but we'll also share it with you later. Even if you plan to live to 150, you still need a will. Get started today. Why does this work? It works because it's a little bit teasing, right? Everyone's like, oh yeah, I guess I am mortal, but it doesn't really call anybody out for it. And has this sort of inclusive everybody element. Other effective messaging, supporters of our humane society, or whatever your organization is, from 18 to 88, choose to include us in their will or trust. Would you like information on how to join them? Right? All these other people of all ages do this. So it's not like we're only talking to the folks who are over 85. And that becomes a much more comfortable conversation instead of saying, many of our 90-year-olds choose to put this in their will. That's a more difficult thing that is met with more resistance. All right, third path, going really big on qualified charitable distributions. So these are the fastest growing type of philanthropy over the last few years. For many seniors, it will be the single best way to give. Let's talk about qualified charitable distributions. I know we've had some questions on this. Let's dive in here. So what are they? This is going to be familiar to many of you. Gifts from an IRA, right? They're gifts from an IRA. They're also known as IRA charitable rollover gifts. Money is transferred directly from an IRA account, directly, not through the donor, to a 501c3 charity. Donors must be 70 and a half to give and can give up to $100,000 annually tax-free. A big driver behind these are what are called required minimum distributions. This is how much the government says you have to take out of your IRA every year once you're 72. You have to take it and you have to pay taxes on this. Why does this matter? Because there is so much money in IRAs, right? These are people that started investing in the 60s and 70s and 80s and rode incredible bull markets. So there is more than $10 trillion in IRAs right now. Look at this. I mean, it's only 8, 9, 10 years ago that it was half that. And 20 years ago, it was half that again. And so there's enormous growth here. So much money. People are being forced to take out more money than they need and pay taxes on it, which is why giving has shot up so much. When we asked you whether these gifts are growing over time, look at this. Wow, 85% of folks said my average IRA gift, my average QCD gift has grown. 1% said it's decreased. 15% stayed the same. And so you see this massive shift. The IRAs are growing, the required minimum distributions are growing, and so the giving is growing, which is a really, really good sign for all of us. Why do these work? Money in an IRA, like your 401k, if you have one of those, so you can imagine it's a 401k, is pre-tax. It will always be taxed when you take it out, even if the donor passes away, even, by the way, if those heirs are below the estate tax threshold. Always, always, always taxed. And post-tax money is much more valuable to a donor. You want to be able to conserve that. And so what we're seeing is that people are giving this pre-tax money directly to charity, and it's the only way to avoid paying taxes on it. Over the last 3 years, there's been an almost 400% increase in the QCD gifts that we've seen. The average dollars of those, the average amount of those gifts goes up by 35% last year. Outside of FreeWill, nonprofits reported a 67% increase in the same types of gifts. So these are growing exponentially. Why? More older folks with more money, and those accounts are growing. And so it's a really remarkable shift that we need to be on top of. You can expect, and we've sort of modeled this out, potentially 70% more growth in QCDs in 22 over 2021. Why? Because 10,000 boomers are becoming eligible every single day. The stock market growth, still a lot of fluctuations, still up over last year, means larger IRA balances, and more donors are aware here. There's a ton of increased, thank you to not only you, but all the organizations supporting you by also marketing this. 85% of organizations marketed more last year than they did in 2020, and 85% said they're going to market more this year. And so there's sort of this surround sound effect where older donors are hearing a lot about this, and it makes it even more important that they know they can give one of these to you, right? So it's a really interesting dynamic happening where the whole sector is saying, hey, older donors, who, by the way, make up a ton of our giving, let's make sure you know about this because it's better for you and it's better for us. These gifts tend to be quite large compared to cash. But when we say, how well do you think your donors understand QCDs? 46% say moderately well, a relatively small percentage say somewhat, 14% say not at all. This little orange sliver at the top is very well. So basically no one said, my donors understand this very well. So why is education so important? Is because once folks make this gift once, it becomes the recurring annual gift they make every year. You never age out of QCDs. Giving a QCD is better than cash. It helps meet that required minimum distribution. It saves you on taxes. It conserves post-tax money, which you'd always want to have instead. Stocks and QCDs end up much better for you because they just end up being much larger from the same donors, right? So it's a real win-win all around as long as we make sure that donors understand it. So how do we actually nail this? One, start the QCD outreach early. The first money that someone takes out of the IRA counts toward that RMD. So you want to make sure you get to them before they satisfy their required minimum distribution. If a donor is withdrawing funds but doesn't need the money to live on, they should make that QCD before taking out funds for themselves. This will prevent them from adding to their taxable income. Now, ensuring donors know about the benefits of QCDs will help them be more strategic with their giving, and you really want to shift anyone who's giving cash towards giving QCDs. Better for them, larger gifts for you. So when we look at this, 85% of folks say they plan on increasing QCD marketing. And look at how perfect correlation is from how often do you market QCDs between how many do you get. So 3 or more times, 73% of folks got 10 or more gifts compared to quite a few less, right? It's not that confusing. If donors know they can do it, they want to do it. If they don't know that they can do it, they won't do it. And so you really have to think about, do we have a 3, 4, 5-part education series for older donors on QCDs? Because, wow, this is going to make us all better off. All right. When you think about this, outreach should start by making it easy to give from your website. Gifts are 4 times more likely to come from web links. Also, when you're having one-on-one conversations with donors, these are a great time to bring up QCDs. And remember, such a large percentage of your donors are over 70, in some cases, much more than half. You can mention this in your outreach, even if you don't have perfect age data. Just say, hey, just so you know, in case you're over 70, this is available. Also, all those folks who are not currently 70 will likely turn 70 at some point, so it's okay to tell them about this. Just a couple of tips there. One thing one place that does this really well is Southern Poverty Law Center. You can see actually on their donate page, they have a link here. So it's not buried in some sort of esoteric ways to give page. when people are checking out, they see this and say, oh, maybe I should shift to give that way. And now I'm going to get a much larger gift. Same thing, St. Mary's College is mailing to all of their folks over 70. Colleges are especially good at this because they have perfect birthday information, and shares, wow, you can save on income taxes on this gift. What a great way to give for someone like you. Okay, tip 2, if you don't have it already, it's time to start collecting age data. You can send out a quick survey to all your supporters. This will demonstrate that you want to hear from your community. You can also include a few demographic questions to update your database, figure out who are likely prospects for QCD giving. If you don't have age data, you can't send a survey, you may want to include these as a way to give in all of your fundraising appeals. You can give this as one of several ways to give. You can add a PS that calls out supporters over 75. Here's an example from our friends over at Second Harvest of Silicon Valley. And you can see this is just a normal fundraising message. It's a pretty powerful one, it's well written, but it's sort of one of many that they'll send. PS, if you're 7.5 or older, which is a big percentage of their donor base, you can make this gift. And so that's quite useful. All right, we'll go for a few more minutes, then we'll get to some questions. You want to educate and simplify for donors. So donors are much more confused than you think. If QCDs are new to you and you're a professional fundraiser, then you can bet they're new to your donors. You want to make sure we understand the key paths and help people walk through them. For some people, the average time to find the right form is 25 minutes, right? The banks aren't doing a really good job making this easy for folks. You should be running trainings for major gift officers on QCDs and common questions. Most of your gift officers are more confused than you think. We've run trainings at major Ivy League institutions, and not surprisingly, half the gift officers don't really know what QCDs are. So having a couple of conversations makes this easy for folks and can be really important. Other things that a lot of people are choosing to do now is you see a lot of organizations using tools. There's a FreeWill one, there are probably other ones in the market that help donors really navigate this and make it a couple-minute process instead of complicated. And that tends to be really, really successful for folks. And so a lot of people are shifting towards more online tools for things like qualified charitable distributions. When we think about advanced tactics, many people are taking qualified charitable distributions or making them at the same time every year. And so if someone made a QCD to you last June, you want to follow up with them 6 weeks before that happened. Why? Because it's likely that their financial planning is happening at the same time every year. And so that's a really important point. Second thing, IRA gifts, because they'll always be taxed, remember, are one of the best types of plan gifts. And there's a big surge in that happening. So you want to ask QCD donors if they'd like to learn more about making your organization a beneficiary of their IRA. Most donors don't know they can make recurring gifts through qualified charitable distributions, but for many banks, not all, many banks, you can do so through a checkbox on the form. So recurring QCDs are also a great tool, right? These are a little bit more advanced, but they're a really great tool for sophisticated fundraisers. One other note here is that American Heart Association and our friends over at AHA are leading a coalition of nearly 60 organizations that are helping Congress navigate legislation which allows seniors to fund things like life income gifts from their IRAs and increase the amount that donors can give as QCDs. So nonprofits can see overall giving go up by as much as $1 billion if this happens. Emily over at AHA is great. And Jeff over at AHA also working there. Here's Emily's email address if you want to get involved. I think they're also in the chat. I think they've joined today. And so feel free to, oh, thanks, Emily. Feel free to reach out to them as well. Really, really, really sharp folks over there. All right, so a couple of resources and we'll wrap up. First thing is my colleague Simone is going to drop in the chat right now. I think that is the Legacy Act. My colleague Simone is going to drop a survey. Thank you, Simone. This is where we'll be able to select folks for these books. So if you get a chance to fill it out, To Kill a Mockingbird, Slaughterhouse 5, and the other ones as well. I'm just making a note there. Make sure to include your address because otherwise we can't send it to you. That happens sometimes. Second thing is we've just finalized our 2022 report on qualified charitable distributions. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Simone, a bunch of other folks here. If you'd like this and you'd like to share it with your organization, just make a note. So please do that. And then there are a bunch of best-in-class tools that we put together on getting qualified charitable distributions. These are all come with best-in-class training and writing and strategy. So that's really exciting. Some tools on stock giving, and then some tools on planned giving, which have now crossed the $5 billion mark in bequests. So if you're interested in any of these, feel free to make a note in the chat. Someone can reach out to you. If you're not, don't worry about that at all. We're so glad you're here. We're excited to do this. And then on Thursday, in 2 days, we also have a crypto tool that now 1,000 organizations have signed up for, which is really, really exciting. I will be running a session on Thursday, walking through these tools. And one fascinating thing I learned this week, which has blown my mind and may blow yours, is there are now more people in the United States with cryptocurrency than with savings accounts, right? This is sort of the massive adoption that, as we talked about all the trends that have shaped older donors, the biggest trend shaping younger donors is actually crypto and crypto tools. So on Thursday, I'll run a session walking you through that, and if you're interested as well. You can also, by the way, just sign up for the wait list. The tool has no annual subscription cost, so a lot of people are really hopping on it quickly. And then my colleague Alyssa, who's just wonderful, is doing a walkthrough on some case studies and some tools around planned and major giving. And so if you want to join that, you are more than welcome to. These things are pretty chill, so feel free to bring your lunch or bring coffee and just hang out and listen to what Alyssa has to say. Yeah, and then if you need a demo of any of the tools, we'll do that. Okay, let's get on to some Q&A, because I know we covered so much. This is probably the thickest session we have all year. There's just so much to cover when you talk about massive generations of donors. So I'm going to take a quick look at some of the questions, and then we'll come back on that. If you haven't already, please fill out the survey. That will sort of help us always do better. Most people who come, by the way, fill it out, and then we use all the learnings to either create new topics, or in some cases, like you saw today, address certain questions or address certain topics within a sort of narrower band that's really helpful to folks. So, all right. Oh, and one other thing before, because I know some folks have to drop off before we get to Q&A. Next week, so in 7 days from today, we are going to do a deep dive on donor advised funds. Now, this is actually one of my favorite topics, because it's so interesting, right? There's sort of some basic stuff about donor advised funds, but then you dig into why is that true and why is that true? And what are the trends sort of shaping the trend of donor advised funds, and what does it teach us about giving and what we should be doing differently? Because a lot of times trends in donor advised funds are sort of early to show up and then show up at our organizations a couple years later. So we'll explore a little bit of that. If you want to RSVP to that, same thing in the survey. Super easy. All right, so we'll take like 5 minutes on questions now, and then we'll give everyone a little bit of time back. Good questions, and a lot of them. So let's figure out which one is the best. Okay, so how do you suggest we text donors? Is it professional to make this first communication with a donor? Should we ask their permission for texting before assuming we should? Shannon, I would think about this as not dissimilar to phone calls. So if you would call somebody, you should feel comfortable texting them. If you would send them a letter, you should feel comfortable texting them, right? They'll tell you, hey, I prefer not to chat over text. But this is different, by the way, than just mass sending text. That may be useful. What we've seen, though, is that one-to-one communication, the same way you would text me or you text one of your friends, is really, really valuable. We have seen extremely little, actually I haven't heard of any instances where donors get upset from receiving text. Now, donors get upset sometimes about receiving phone calls, but nobody shies away from that. And so these tend to be way more welcomed. You can just sort of go ahead and ask them, your donors, if you're not comfortable yet, but generally we would say just go for it and you'll hear back, right? And sometimes people think, oh, should I text my donors or not? You've got a 200-person portfolio if you're a gift officer, maybe it's 150 people. Go text 10 of them this week and see how it goes, right? You should welcome yourself to experiment before texting everybody and give that a sense, but we're not putting people on a giant sort of text chain or a huge WhatsApp group, right? We're just texting them one-on-one. And so if they don't respond, they don't respond. But we've seen very little blowback, and instead people really like this way of communicating. What's the best way to text a donor, more casual, professional? Natalie asked this question. We would use language that you would use to a professional colleague, right? So it's not overly stilted, right? You need to sound like the human that you are, but you don't need to lead off with, a dozen emojis. And so you might say, hi, Natalie. I was at the food bank today. We saw a couple dozen families being fed. I know this is something you help fund. Just wanted to let you know and say thank you again. End of text, right? That's a great message to receive out of the blue. It can make someone's day. And so do that as well. Sarah, any recommended times or months for QCD information distribution? We find that tax season is quite useful, certainly before end of year, certainly January, and then making sure that you're putting some stuff early in the year, right? So that folks, before you get that required minimum distribution, and then thinking about giving season, et cetera. So a lot of people wait till the end of year, but it is sort of all over the place in terms of giving. As you get more QCDs, you'll start to see when are these gifts happening and start shifting your marketing a couple months before your major spikes of qualified charitable distributions. Great. I know that everyone's IRA size is different. Do you have an average size of a QCD given to an organization? We see it that it's between $3,000 and $4,000. For many people, it's much larger. And for many people, it's the largest gift, right? So you might think about what sort of QCD am I going to get? It might be 3 or 4 times someone's previous largest gift. You're seeing a really big shift overall. Okay, time for one more question. This is good from Margot. And fascinating. We had a very similar question from Carolyn. For qualified charitable distributions, do we need to have a broker to sell the funds, the stocks, et cetera? Or are they sold and we just get a check? Great question. Sorry this wasn't clear. Qualified charitable distributions are just cash. So within their IRA, they've sold something and they're sending you just straight US dollars. And so it's very simple and very easy that way, right? You as an organization don't have to do anything special. Now, one catch here is that sometimes you'll just get a check from Fidelity with no donor name attached. And that's why some of these tools are even more useful. So you make sure we're tracking which gifts are coming in and who they're from. Because if it's the biggest gift I've ever given you, I really want to make sure I get that thank you note. And you need to make sure what sort of tax treatment to give it, because these gifts are not tax deductible. They're sort of pre-tax. And so that's just a small note. All right, well, let's pause here. We know that you all have meetings starting in a few minutes. And so just a really big thank you for joining this week. I know there is a ton that we covered. So check out the slides or the recording if some of it moved too quickly. Really would love to see you next week if you're around. Also feel free to hop on Thursday and we'll talk more about crypto. We'll talk about millennials and Gen Z, a whole other world. They're a bit wild. And so we'll share that as well. But I think you all have obviously so much going on, and that you're taking this time to push yourself and grow your career and really improve your skills to hit your mission speaks well of you. So thank you so much for making it. Thank you to Simone and other folks who put a ton of work into making this and doing all the research. And I will see you hopefully in a week and talk about donor advised funds, which is a whole other can of worms, and we'll dive in then. So thank you again. See you next Tuesday and talk soon.